On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Foundation for the Carolinas, inspiring philanthropy and empowering individuals to create a better community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
I believe that stewardship is not simply a moral act, but it's a one of design. I believe that you have to make conscious decisions about that stewardship that lead to knowing when to engage, when to get out of the way, what your specific skill set is, when other people are more important to you or to the task at hand. I believe that there's a kind of language that is developed through the act of design that is about stewardship for all of us. So if there's one principle that I'd put my finger on, it has to do with stewardship.
Ken Lambla is founding dean of the College of Arts and Architecture at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he has served on the faculty since 1983. The College of Arts and Architecture is comprised of academic units in architecture, art history, dance, music, and theater. Ken's teaching has focused on architectural design, design process, and social history. He has worked as an architect and urban designer in Belfast, Chicago, San Francisco, and throughout North Carolina. His research has focused on social histories of housing projects in Chicago and Rotterdam during the first quarter of the 20th century. In this episode, we explore his return from sabbatical in Patagonia, the founding of the College of Arts and Architecture, interdisciplinary design, stewardship, and how the arts have informed his life. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Ken, welcome.
Thank you.
Ken, you just came back from 3 months of camping in Patagonia. What was that about?
Beauty, solitude, bewilderment. We drove 9,400 kilometers, crisscrossing Patagonia. We began in Santiago. We traveled south through what's called the Lake District. We went to Chiloé, which is an island off the coast, and then we crossed over to the mountain region of Chile and basically crisscrossed our way between Chile and Argentina. Ended up in Argentina, in the very south of Argentina. There's a city called Ushuaia, which is typically seen as the southernmost town in Argentina. And then we went further south on a very small dirt road to reach the furthest south point that you can drive. So we covered a lot of territory. It was a lot of driving, but it also took us to natural sites and some national parks that were very important in South America and Patagonia specifically. We camped in a van. It brings your life into a more simple mode. And a recurring story about camping in a van for 10 weeks is you meet a different sort of people camping than you do elsewhere when you're traveling. You're immediately close with who's ever close to you on the ground with the elements: rain, snow, dirt, water, lack of water. And so you just have an immediate connection. And that was really, really wonderful. That's about designing a life transition. That's about being conscious and thoughtful about moving from one position of your life to the next position in your life. It's about the appreciation of nature. It's about the magnificence of the planet we live on and the threats to that planet. I'm a big believer in firsthand experiences, and so you have to go. You have to be there.
Ken, during those 10 weeks, Who did you find yourself becoming?
Wow. I think I was very conscious about having had a career in academia and administration. I was very conscious of the fact that it was just June, my wife and I. We've been married for 45 years, so you think you know each other and you think you know what you're interested in, and every day was a surprise. And so that simplicity combined with the surprise sort of leads you to respect the uncertainties of your daily life because you can protect yourself against those, and to appreciate where you are. I learned something 10 or 15 years ago when I engaged in a lot of leadership development coursework, which is how to be present. Someone said, "Why do you have meetings?" I said, "Oh, you need to, get information or something." And they said, "No, you have meetings to be with other people." And so being present is a very, very important principle. And I felt in Patagonia that I could be present to the circumstances which I did not know about, and then respond accordingly.
And what are you bringing back with you from the trip?
Peace and solitude. I think a different kind of thoughtfulness and a different kind of perspective on this place, Charlotte and North Carolina. We're going to stay here. I have incredible respect for who lives here and the efforts put forth by this community. And so, in a certain sense, releasing myself from fixed administrative role at the university allows me to think more clearly about what points of contact I can be most useful in serving.
Ken, prior to your trip, you had served for 11 years as founding dean of the College of Arts and Architecture at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. How would you describe the college?
The College of Arts and Architecture is somewhat unique in the country inasmuch as it combines design professions, visual arts, and performing arts. There were at the time only 7 other colleges in the country that were comprised of those units. So the academic units are the School of Architecture, the Department of Art and Art History, the Department of Dance, the Department of Music, and the Department of Theater. We also have quite a few entities within the college that serve as research vehicles. Digital Arts Center, for example, Shakespeare in Action, for example. And we also have several interdisciplinary programs across the university, beginning with the honors program that we established at the outset of the college and extending all the way through to graduate programs with engineering and business.
There is a story about how the College of Arts and Architecture came about. It's an idea that you proposed. When and how did the idea begin to form?
I started at UNC Charlotte on the faculty in 1983, and in 1998, I had become chair in the College of Architecture. After 17, 18 years, I started thinking about where the future of my career might be and what kind of skills I would need to continue. The sitting dean of the College of Architecture had announced his retirement, and so I considered whether or not I would be interested in such a position. Being a dean is not a simple extension of being a faculty member. It's a completely different role and set of responsibilities. I had been at UNC Charlotte and had participated in quite a few broad university-wide initiatives, everything from international studies to Crossroads Charlotte, for example. And so I had a lot of contact with other academic units and could see the complexion of UNC Charlotte changing as it went from 11,000 students to, at the time, we were probably at 23 or 24,000 students. I felt the responsibility of the next dean was to position the college in a new role as the research identity of UNC Charlotte was coming more to the forefront. By that time, we had developed maybe 6 or 7 or 8 PhD programs. So as a chair, I sort of looked at that future and said, well, we need to position arts and design in a more prominent role as UNC Charlotte continues to develop and grow. So I sort of thought, in my application for the deanship that this was the moment where conceiving of a different role for the college was formed. And then, well, you have to design it.
Did you make your idea known during the selection process to become dean?
Not really. I had developed the idea, but I was applying at the time for the dean of the College of Architecture. Having been on the faculty of architecture for 18 years, I knew what the constraints and the opportunities were around being the next dean of the College of Architecture. But the bigger vision was about the university as a whole. And so in the final stages of the application process, I was interviewed by the Chancellor Woodward, and the sitting provost at the time, Denise Trouth. And at that time, I said, I think it's time for us to not just hire the next dean of architecture, but to talk about the feasibility of a broader structural change. Universities are institutions which are in many ways resistant to changing their basic structure. And so I asked that they consider that if they saw me or offered me the job as dean, would they consider doing a feasibility study to change the college structure? And that specifically within the history of architecture programs, which are oftentimes aligned with engineering, geography, or the arts, that the arts were most naturally a part of UNC Charlotte's identity. And so they agreed, and I was offered the job.
What case did you make to your colleagues?
Well, that's an interesting question, because at the time they offered me the job, my colleagues didn't know that this was my real ambition. After being offered the position as dean, there were 2 years of administrative change where I was able to quietly talk about the possibility of the role of our disciplines within the university as a whole. And in that period of time, I approached the sitting chairs of the arts units and the interim chair of the College of Architecture with the future of a merger. When Joan Lorden came to be provost, she immediately appointed a task force to do a feasibility study. That task force included faculty from the university, but also included some important cultural leaders in Charlotte, Suzanne Fetcher from the McCall Center, Lee Kiesler, at the time the head of the Arts and Science Council, and Michael Marsicano from the Foundation for the Carolinas. I think that enabled the conversation and the scope of the structural change to expand and became more inclusive. It resulted in a positive outcome. And from there, we went into another 2-year period in which the actual administrative structure was examined within the context of the UNC system, because this had to be a system change and not just a campus change.
Did you encounter resistance?
Yes, it's a fact of life, but it was respectful. People had invested their careers in the work they were doing. Anyone comes along and says we're going to reshuffle the deck and think how we're working in the context of a college. A college is essentially a community, and so you depend on each other. So there was a respectful skepticism as we moved forward with an internal evaluation of what the benefits were. But I think in the end, everyone recognized that we could not stay still while the rest of the university was moving towards a research institution and growing dramatically. Arts and design were not growing dramatically. We had spatial financial limitations that wouldn't allow the kind of explosive growth that is occurring, let's say, in computers or sciences.
What goals did you articulate for the college?
There were 4 very specific goals that I felt after the feasibility studies that would help us achieve our larger mission. And those goals included very specific, very tangible things. The first was to move the arts and design fields into a more prominent, visible position in the identity of UNC Charlotte. The second goal was to articulate and demonstrate the arts and design-based research agenda. The third goal was to seek national accreditation for all the units in the college. And the fourth goal was to establish graduate programs in the arts. We had graduate programs in architecture, but we did not have graduate programs in the arts.
The college launched in 2008, and you left the college as dean in 2018. Over that 10-year period, were those goals met?
Essentially, yes. I would say the first goal in terms of the position of the arts at UNC Charlotte has definitely been met. We have a more recognized presence and a recognized participation in the university's identity and its visibility. I could use Center City Building as an example of that, and the wonderful work happening in the Projective Eye Gallery as well as public programming. I think that the research mission is definitely also met because we have been able to articulate the kind of research distinct from other disciplines that the arts are responsible for contributing to an institution at a national level and international level. The third goal of national accreditation for all units has been met as of 2 months ago. So we now have national recognition for all our programs, which is curriculum and the structure of the instructional programs in all of our disciplines, which is a very big deal. And the fourth goal of graduate programs in the arts has not yet been met, but it's what I'm going to focus the next couple of years of my life doing.
Ken, when you reflect on your time as dean, what did you and the college get right?
I think the most important thing that we got right was demonstrating that the quality of the work happening in the units of the college does reach regional and national, and in many cases international significance. I think that we moved ourselves mentally and programmatically into a position where we could engage in work that was seen to help develop the disciplines of the college. I also think that that issue of quality addresses the students in a very direct way, because the students needed to see this faculty and the interaction they have with faculty within the context of the broader scope of their education, what they do after they graduate. 100% of our dance education students get jobs. 100% of our architecture students get jobs. Jobs is not the only measure of success in education. And so the continued educational trajectory of our students has been much better than I could have ever dreamed for. So I think we got right that quality matters, and that it's not just a question of being able to finish the program, but to see oneself developing habits of mind that are literally lifelong and address lifelong concerns.
What do you think you and the college could have done better?
I think that we have developed a strong interdisciplinary culture, and I think that we still have more work to do when it comes to developing concrete partnerships, both on campus but also within the community. You know, it's important for people to understand that a faculty member at a research institution has a very specific, fairly individualized career trajectory that is focused on their particular skill, their discipline, their outcome. But at the same time, I feel strongly that there's a kind of tension between the individual and the collective. And so we could have maybe articulated some of that more strongly or more clearly so that people could see and students could participate.
I'm wondering if you can help me understand that in real terms.
That's a good question. The question of what could we do better? I think that the improvements I would envision that we could make have to do with being able to articulate the significance and role of the arts and design fields within this community. So we're always having to kind of participate in the broader conversation. So, for example, issues of infrastructure development in Charlotte, schools in Charlotte, the social welfare in Charlotte. Those are all things that I think the population as a whole are still wondering, well, what do the arts have to do with that? And I think it sets us up for a next generation challenge.
Is the College of Arts and Architecture today what you hoped it would be?
Well, I have to answer that yes. But at the same time, I understand there's an interesting dialectic between an institution being fixed and an institution that is dynamic. And I feel as though we've accomplished that kind of balance. Yes, we have things we'd like to be doing better, but that dynamic is very much alive. And it's about the people in the college, the students, the faculty, and the staff. And I think everyone is working in a very kind of conscious way to make improvements in incremental terms. So, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that.
When the powers that be in the city consider issues that need to be addressed, is the College of Arts and Architecture at the forefront of that discussion and considered of value in that discussion?
Not always. I think in certain areas we very much are. My colleague Deb Ryan is the chair of the Planning Commission. My retired colleague David Walters has participated in numerous urban design conversations that have led to, frankly, establishing the paradigm of placemaking as a zoning principle. I think that within the arts disciplines, that our role in theater, for example, at the Children's Theater is consistent and very strong. I think probably 50 to 60% of the visual arts faculty have been honored with residencies at the McCall Center. I think that the dance program has brought forth national and international work through some of the recreated Martha Graham, Paul Taylor pieces that we've brought to Charlotte. I think that there's a kind of active research agenda with regard to everything from Shakespeare to new printing techniques and active participation on boards, arts boards across the whole city spectrum. So I think sometimes we're a little quiet about that, but we're there.
Why is the work of the College of Arts and Architecture important?
The College of Arts and Architecture, being unique in its structure, I think exemplifies the kind of broad cross-disciplinary opportunities that students are looking for. I think in the back of my head, although those 4 goals are articulated, they don't mention students. And I think students of today are more dynamic, they're extremely articulate, and they understand the role of cultural work as it relates to community cohesion, economic development, $380 billion a year in the United States. They understand that they can play a leadership role through their cultural acumen. And so I think for all of those reasons, the work that we provide, the setting we provide, enables students to see over the boundary that they have proclaimed, whether it be art or dance, and into the active engagement of those skills in the cultural change that is occurring in this community.
Ken, you grew up in New Jersey. How would you describe your childhood?
Fairly frenetic. I come from a large family. I have 5 sisters and 1 brother. I'm number 2. There was always action. And I think the New Jersey context was actually very important to me making a decision about being an architect. But it also put me in contact with everything from issues of race and history. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s. I was born in Newark. The race riots of the mid-60s were right at my doorstep. I think that we did not have a culturally rich family in the sense of going to performances and exhibits on a weekly basis, but I think I could see what affected the social quality of my community through all of the other children and friends in my environment. I could leave school and get to New York City whenever I wanted to. It was easy. And I think that it gave me access to, in an unpolished way, a lot of things on the street level that became important to me.
What was important to your family?
That's a really good question. That's a hard question to actually answer. I think my family was oriented towards the future. My father distrusted the study of history, which is unfortunate, but it was the upbringing that he had. We grew up in a large family, so solidarity and cohesion were important. There was a sense that you mattered to the big picture, and so one never felt isolated. And I think that develops into a sense of responsibility and a responsibility to figuring out, well, how can I contribute? I grew up with a very strong affiliation in the YMCA and Boy Scouts and sports. And so in a sense, those were typical things, but it also brought me into daily contact with the kind of panoply of who was in the community, ethnically, in terms of age, in terms of what people were interested in that I didn't know anything about. So there's a curiosity that is part of daily life.
When you think about your father and mother, what comes to mind?
My father was a businessman, purchasing agent with a very large multinational chemical company. I knew very little about what he did. That wasn't important to him. My mother, having 7 children, was sort of constantly in either childbearing or child rearing moments. And so I lived a life that there was a constant attention to the youthfulness of the family. And that was good.
Ken, there was a high school teacher of yours who became important to you.
His name is Joe Stokes. He is still alive and living, retired now in Columbus, Ohio. I still see him on an annual basis. I think what's important about Joe is somehow we sort of passed through the topic of architecture. I think he was the first person that used that word in front of me. But what we really talked about was descriptive geometry and the way in which what might be seen as drafting became a way of understanding the world. He described how geometry is connected to physics, how it's connected to communication, how you draw something that you cannot see. And so this thing that all of us deal with, which is the balancing act between the concrete and the abstract, became the conversation that 55 years later we're still having. And there's a great deal of value of talking to somebody for 50 years. And so he was important to my long-term trajectory.
When did you begin to think of yourself as an architect?
I think it was during my engagement with Joe in that high school classroom that I saw architecture as having the breadth to give me opportunities to apply my interests, everything from mathematics to science to beauty and aesthetics, that I felt that those were subjects that I could enrich through college and then apply to the social context that I was living in and working in and dreaming of. This was the 60s. There was a lot happening in the worlds of art and design that were radically different. I felt like being part of that was better than watching it.
Were you drawn to a school of design?
I would say that I was drawn to the abstraction called architecture. My evaluation of colleges was much more about what's changing in the education to be an architect and then evaluating what kind of architect I wanted to be. I wanted to study ethics and I wanted to study aesthetics, which are not subjects you're going to get in high school. And I wanted to be able to be in a place that combined issues of the natural environment with the social environment.
And you were articulating these things as a high school student?
Probably not articulating them, probably just sort of stewing on them as I was sitting in the church pew or walking down the street. You learn those things by studying the clouds and reading books, of course, but you feel those things becoming important. You don't make proclamations about them.
Ken, your family moved to St. Louis during your late teenage years. What was formative about that time?
Well, first and foremost was the abrupt, dramatic change from the environment I truly loved in New Jersey to the western fringe of St. Louis, Missouri, where across the road Daniel Boone probably lived. And so I was thrown into a very different environment and had to learn how to rely on myself and a couple of close friends and a completely different environment with a completely different outlook. On the other hand, St. Louis as a city became very fascinating to me. Its cultural history, its architectural history was very significant. And so I struggled in high school for sure as I led up to applying to colleges, but that was an important struggle. I believe in the concept of struggle as a form of self-improvement.
Ken, you went to the University of Kansas and studied environmental design, which was a new field at the time. What drew you to environmental design?
It was really the combination of two points of emphasis within a very new curriculum. The architecture program at the University of Kansas had always been within the College of Engineering, and it was the first time that it was sort of released from the engineering construct. And it had a brand new dean, and it was several programs in the country were beginning to look at environmental design as a more thorough method to engage environmental forces, the natural forces, with the social forces that affected architectural form. That seemed to me to be more comprehensive than the strict application of structural principles to building shape. So there was a sort of dynamism that was part of environmental design. And I think the ethos of environmental design came through more clearly. My very first professor in that curriculum worked for Frank Lloyd Wright for 17 years, so one might assume that he was a devotee of the master builder architect as hero model. But our very first conversation walking down the sidewalk was about the social milieu of architecture and how architecture set the tone for, was a prompt for social engagement. That conversation on the sidewalk resonates with me today. I got a very good education through that medium.
Ken, was the interdisciplinary nature of the program at Kansas the seed that later became the fruit of the College of Arts and Architecture?
I would have to say yes. That enabled me to see the connectedness in the academy that would lead to a more productive connectedness in the community, and I would have to say yes. And it was a surprise. I didn't go to do that, but every year it began to see more and more opportunities along those lines. And so I began to pay more attention to visual arts and then began to pay more attention to performing arts while an undergraduate student. And so, yes.
What happened after you graduated?
When I graduated from the University of Kansas, I entered the VISTA program, which is the Domestic Peace Corps. I was sent to training in Atlanta. I had never been in the South. I had a very good training program, but was assigned to Memphis, Tennessee, to interview African-American residents of the Beale Street urban renewal area. And frankly, I didn't think that was the best use of my skills, and there was a lot of anger around that, and having a white man travel around neighborhoods interviewing African-Americans who had been displaced was probably not what I was best suited for. I returned to Kansas. My wife and I got married. I rethought my future education and applied to and was accepted at NC State for graduate school.
Ken, you studied at NC State and Chapel Hill and then had a pivotal experience overseas. Where did you go and what happened?
When I arrived at NC State, living in Raleigh, two of my classmates from the University of Kansas had been offered positions with the newly formed Northern Ireland Housing Executive through the invitation of a former common professor. At that point in my career, I was convinced that I was going to become a housing architect and save the world through housing. And so anything that had to do with studying housing design and housing development and housing law was very important to me. Having progressed through 3 semesters at NC State and Chapel Hill, they kept inviting me to join them, and my wife and I decided to go. It was an unusual time period in Northern Ireland because the Troubles were about 7 years old, and we arrived 1 month after a general strike that really was pivotal in the history of the Troubles. But we also arrived at a time, as we were looking for a place to live, we joined a group of people which was comprised of another architect, an urban planner, a historian, a playwright, and a college professor, and we all lived in a common house. I think the context of Belfast, Northern Ireland, in which there were car bombings and there was constant security warnings, but living within a home that was very culturally active with almost nightly concerts, nightly readings, nightly debates over dinner about not just the Troubles, but about the movement of the arts in time, not only began to develop friendships in a very deep way, but also developed a kind of awareness, alertness to the fragility of our lives in a cultural sense. We are still very close to those people. We just returned this past New Year's Eve from the 50th annual New Year's Eve banquet that was started in 1968. And so we are very close to the lifelong kind of engagement in the way in which Northern Ireland as a place, and Ireland generally, was very important to learning that a culture driven by language and literary history, a culture driven by the beauty of the natural environment and landscape, a culture driven by how people live together and not independently of each other, were all things that came to us at a very important moment in our life.
Ken, after your experience in Ireland, you came back to the United States to begin practicing architecture, and you spent some time in Chicago.
Correct. I think the Chicago time is somehow maybe equally important as the Belfast time, because I came back at a time when there were not many jobs in architecture. I found a position with a very unusual firm, Chicago Associates Planners and Architects. And the reason they were unusual is that they broke all the norms for the organization of architectural practice. They embraced a development arm. They embraced a construction management arm. They embraced the role of the architect in planning, both urban design and natural environmental design on the suburban fringe of Chicago. I was involved in their institutional projects, having been the project architect for a major remodeling of a civic center and 2 college buildings. And I also worked on the team that designed the first public housing project that the Department of Housing and Urban Development funded after the important 1976 Supreme Court hearing. So we were involved with community-based architecture, and we were also involved in developing projects that no one else would do. So that was an important time. I was able to begin some teaching at the University of Illinois and co-teach with one of my associates from that firm. And in developing curriculum, you're always kind of asking yourselves, well, so what is important to convey to a student who's just starting? So there was a number of things that we got engaged in Chicago that are very important to my wife and I. It was in Chicago that my wife moved from her early career as an art director for Rand McNally and took up painting as a profession, as an independent artist. And that was important because while you can look at art and look at artists, being an artist became important to our household. And she worked in a very strong community at a very historic studio called Tree Studios that was on a daily basis. The activity of painting became more and more present in her work. So as my wife became a painter, a professional painter, that began to put me in more contact and more intimate awareness of the role of the visual arts as it complemented the work I was doing in architecture. When we moved from Chicago to California for me to take up graduate studies and finish my first professional degree in architecture so that I could be a licensed architect, she moved into a role as a master intaglio printer with a world-famous firm called Crown Point Press. That began to further inform and intensify the role of the arts in my life. She was working with the likes of Richard Diebenkorn and Wayne Thiebaud and John Cage and Robert Bechtel. And those people, I think anyone would recognize as being, at the time in the early 80s, the sort of world-class artists of our era. I would go to poetry readings and whale-watching trips with John Cage, for example. Our union as husband and wife became part and parcel of the way in which I could see developing my own career. At the same time, having taught some in Chicago, I then pursued a teaching assistantship at the University of California, Berkeley. And that sort of solidified my interest in pursuing a permanent career in education.
Ken, what brought you to North Carolina?
When I was at Berkeley and considering a full-time career in education, I applied to many schools. But I think coming to Charlotte, North Carolina became kind of the obvious decision. Charlotte was an emerging city in 1983. It offered the opportunity for me to start a practice, which I did, at the same time as holding a full-time faculty position. The city of Charlotte made some very important positive decisions in its development through the Center City effort, and the university was making some very positive decisions about how it was going to grow. So Charlotte was a perfect environment for a young faculty member in my discipline.
What courses did you teach?
I began my career teaching in second year sophomore design studios, and I was brought here to introduce to the curriculum a theory-based seminar that paralleled those design studios to introduce students across the curriculum into not only a historic assessment, but a course that would give them grounding in the principles of architectural form. I was also asked to develop a course in the social history of architecture, and so that was close to my heart because of the social milieu that I had been discussing with faculty and developing, by that point, a whole series of experiences around how architecture affects the social cohesion of a community.
Ken, is there something at the core of what you value that you wanted your students to learn?
I have always taught architecture to be a form of community development. And so the form-based education of an architect, while important, while critical, was also complemented by the effect and interaction of human beings with the space that they live in. I believe that architecture is a setting for people to improve their lives and potentially for those people to improve the environment that we all share. So the concept of stewardship is probably the concept that I most wanted to instill in the students I taught as to how the skill or the wayfinding that they will engage in through architecture affects everything else in their life. I believe that stewardship is not simply a moral act, but it's a one of design. I believe that you have to make conscious decisions about that stewardship that lead to knowing when to engage, when to get out of the way, what your specific skill set is, when other people are more important to you or to the task at hand. I believe that there's a kind of language that is developed through the active design that is about stewardship for all of us. So if there's one principle that I'd put my finger on, it has to do with stewardship.
Ken, what social values do you think should guide what we build?
I think the social values that are probably most important to me have to do with how one learns to listen to each other in concert with the concept of presence as a social value. These are not arbitrary, and they're also not unconscious. So I feel that the issues of social value that lead to both empowerment, but the valuing of all people, and I know this sounds glorious in a sense, but it really comes down to the daily acts, the hourly acts in which we participate with other people. I think all of our work has to do with the shared experience. That's the reason that I went to Patagonia, was to see how that shared experience can be lived out across time and in specific places.
How do values of listening and shared experience show up in architectural form? What does it look like?
It's rooted in what is common space. It's in a certain sense rooted in the idea that architecture is frozen dance. And it is also rooted in a theoretical proposition called a for dance, which proposes that architecture is merely the setting within which those social values are enacted. In a housing project, it has to do with the common space between houses. In an individual office building, it has to do with the common spaces where people interact within that office building. It has to do with the common expectations and the debate over those expectations that occurs. I happen to think that one of the most prominent examples in Charlotte today is the example of Duda Payne's building at the corner of South Tryon and Camden Road, in which it's a very prominent corner, very visible corner, and it's a very gentle building in spite of its dramatic height. It's a building that invites you in, and in the outdoor space around it invites you to sit and reflect and be with other people. So these are very concrete examples in which architecture is not simply a facade, but provides the opportunity for people to engage with other people. And for the unexpected experience of what all of those people will bring once they have an opportunity to do so. Charlotte is a very precious city to a lot of people, and we need more of a kind of informal environment for people to be able to participate.
Is there a place that you go where you are most happy?
I suppose that place is the sanctuary of my neighborhood. I live in Elizabeth. I've lived there for 33 years. I discovered Elizabeth during the process of doing the small area plan in 1984. And I have stayed with some very specific qualities of Elizabeth. Its eclecticism, its fragmentation, its historic relevance to the city of Charlotte. Independence Park was the first water source supply for the city of Charlotte. The role of Independence Boulevard, the fringes of Elizabeth as they help bring together Plaza Midwood and Chantilly and Colonial Heights. And I feel very strongly that I ground myself in that neighborhood.
Ken, you've completed your deanship of a college you founded. What's on your mind as you pass the baton to a new dean?
I think the role of any leader is to make the organization you're part of desirable for the next generation. That applies to students, it applies to staff, it applies to faculty, it applies to administration. And so what's on my mind is probably mostly that the college remains an active and lively place. It remains committed to this community, and it is a place that attracts continued talent. We have a very strong group of people. Any college is defined by the people that are part of it. And so what's on my mind is how we can continue to develop those human skills.
As you look back on your life, have you lived the life you've wanted to live?
I think I've lived the life that I could only dream about. I have felt that I have been able to make changes in who I am and what I do that are consonant with the people and the community that I've been a part of. I feel extremely fortunate to have been able to work with a very broad variety of people who I respect tremendously, and that we've had common purpose.
What's next for you?
Well, there's both a concrete answer and a less concrete answer to that. One is that there are two projects that I will be focused on leading at the university. One is the development of graduate programs in the arts, and the second project is in concert with the Institute for Social Capital to design a cultural metric that leads to a better understanding of the role of culture in social mobility and economic opportunity. What's next for me at a personal level is something I thought deeply about in Patagonia. I think what's next is to return to a consciousness that has to do with the role of art, design, beauty in our lives, with an environmental awareness that probably goes back to the environmental design degree, but is now much more acutely aware of climate change and the human responsibility that we have to address not just the climate change, but the consequences on our environment. I think every day I'm more and more aware of the interconnectedness of pieces of my life that I was only briefly aware of in the past. I'm participating in a couple of lectures, a couple of keynote addresses, a planning project in Italy that all are brought together through this concern that we're still not good environmental designers, but we're capable of doing a lot more and a lot better. So I think that what's next is really to retune myself to what my role might be and to how to educate and how to participate. I'm much more interested now in active participation.
Thanks for your time today, Ken.
Thank you, Mark.
Ken Lambla is founding dean of the College of Arts and Architecture at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He received a bachelor's degree in environmental design from the University of Kansas and a Master of Architecture degree from the University of California, Berkeley. And now, a personal word. In 2017, I read an obituary that made the front page of the New York Times that I marveled reading. It reported the death of Vincent Scully, Sterling Professor Emeritus of the Arts at Yale University. I had read a book Scully had written, and I knew he was a legendary lecturer of architecture and urbanism, and so I was immediately drawn into the story of his life. The obituary noted Professor Scully's many works of scholarship, his influence on generations of undergraduates at Yale, the issues of design he spoke out on, and his changing public views, the architects he championed, his personal history and family. But here is the paragraph that captured me most, written by art critic Richard Woodward. Scully's lectures were theatrical pieces that commonly left his audience transported, and the performer, in his Ivy League uniform of tie and tweed jacket, drained. He did not speak from notes, and students were not expected to take them. Multiple projectors flashed images on the screen in the darkened hall while he wielded a long pointer, the butt of which he would slam on the wooden floor to signal the operator, a coveted job among art history majors, to move to the next glass slide. There it is, a life revealed in one scene. I suspect Professor Scully would have approved. The passion of his lectures, the formality of his clothing, the emotional exhaustion following his teaching, his command of art history, the attention he expected and earned from his students, the images of constructed forms on the screen, the celebrity of his work, and the curiosity he stirred for what would come next. What a way to make an imprint. What a way to live a life. I wonder what one scene would capture me. If I were to write it, I would also be in the classroom, working the board, striding the room, debating students, provoking thought, eliciting feeling, clicker in hand. On the screen would be philosophers of old and ethical issues of the day. Or another scene, in solitude, reading and writing in my loft at home with a view of the city. Or a third scene of my wife and I hosting friends around our dinner table. If others were to write the scene, of course, they might envision something entirely different to say. Every storyteller knows of the one scene that captures the story in full, when everything comes together, when all lessons are learned, when everything is crystallized and revealed. In a teacher's life, there is this moment of completion when the student and teacher each become someone new. I think of Lulu singing "To Sir with Love" to Sidney Poitier, and Ethan Hawke saying "Oh Captain, My Captain" to Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society. I can barely watch those scenes without crying. I receive these cards at the end of the term from students who thank me for our time together in class. They say the most wondrous things about how the class was not what they expected, about how they were challenged, about how they were changed. A few of them talk about difficulties in their lives and deep personal emotions. I read the notes once and put them away. I do my best with their feelings and my own. I send them a note of wonder in return. When Professor Scully died, President Peter Salovey of Yale University said this: "No faculty member in Yale's long history has had greater influence or been more loved. Because of Vince, generations of Yale graduates have learned not just to look, but to see." I cannot imagine a greater reward or more meaningful epitaph. Ken Lambla talked movingly about how the arts have informed his life. He mentioned his high school geometry teacher who introduced him to architecture, the writers and poets and artists who became his friends in Belfast, the visual art and career and partnership of his wife, the musicians and sculptors and designers who have inspired him, the educators who have taught beside him. The interdisciplinary design of his life became the interdisciplinary design of the college he led as founding dean. We share ideas, we carry our audience along, we build something true along the way. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.